He was born around the year 1480, perhaps in Regensburg, perhaps in Altdorf. But wherever his cradle stood, Albrecht Altdorfer would grow into a figure who transformed the visual language of the German Renaissance painter, engraver, architect, counselor, and eventually one of the founding spirits of the Danube School. Altdorfer became the artist who dared to let landscape, not saints or heroes, take center stage. From his father, the painter and miniaturist Ulrich Altdorfer, he inherited both the hand and the hunger for art. His earliest efforts were modest in scale and unconventional in spirit. Intimate little works, often executed in unusual materials, filled with eccentric subjects that caught the curiosity of his contemporaries. Around 1505, he settled in the free imperial city of Regensburg, whose narrow streets and river mists would accompany him for the rest of his life. There, he eventually became city architect and a member of the town council. Responsibilities he balanced alongside an increasingly ambitious artistic career. His first signed pieces, dating from about 1506, already show the fingerprints of the artists he studied fervently. The meticulous niello engravings of Jacopo de Barbari and the refined lines of Albrecht Dürer. Yet even then, Altdorfer was beginning to pull away from rigid convention. Around 1511 he traveled south, down the Danube, toward the Alps. There, confronted by the overwhelming drama of mountain and forest, he experienced a revelation. Landscape, he realized, was more than background. It was a world unto itself, a protagonist, a presence worthy of an artist's full devotion. And in that moment, Altdorfer became, in the true modern sense, the first painter of pure landscape. His pen and wash studies from this period teem with living nature. Dark forests, crumbling firs, larch branches weighed down by moss, hills rising like ancient beasts from the earth. He imbued trees with human gestures, valleys with mystery, twilight with theological force. Even in his religious scenes, the Virgin or Christ seemed less like the central subject than travelers through a vast and breathing world. From 1513 he worked for Emperor Maximilian I in Innsbruck, taking on commissions from the imperial court. As the forces of the Protestant Reformation shook the German lands, he turned increasingly to architecture. Even his paintings began to feature complex architectural arrangements that mirrored the civic responsibilities he carried back in Regensburg. By the 1520s, his reputation had grown, and so had his wealth. He returned to Regensburg as a prominent citizen, served on the city council, and even oversaw major fortification works. His style deepened under the influence of artists such as Giorgione and Lucas Cranach the Elder, culminating in emotionally charged works like his Crucifixion. But in 1529 he received a commission that would push him further than ever before. A commission that would demand from him not only artistry, but imagination on a cosmic scale. It came from Duke William IV of Bavaria. It would become the Battle of Alexander at Issus, and it would change the course of art history. In the late 1520s, Altdorfer, now in his 50s and at the height of his authority, received a request that would dominate his imagination. Duke William IV of Bavaria had begun assembling a cycle of monumental battle paintings for his Munich residence. These works were meant not merely as decoration but as tributes to history's decisive victories, defining moments in which the fate of peoples and empires hung in the balance. To fill this cycle, the Duke called upon the greatest painters in the region. Among them, only one was entrusted with the most spectacular episode of antiquity, the moment when Alexander the Great shattered the armies of Darius III at Issus in 333 BCE. Altdorfer accepted. In doing so, he even declined the prestigious position of burgomaster in Regensburg, explaining to the city council that he wished instead to devote himself fully to a special work for his gracious lord, Duke William. It was to be a painting for the Duke's Lusthaus, a pleasure pavilion at the Munich residence, where 7 other great battle scenes would hang: the death of Marcus Curtius, Caesar's siege of Alesia, and the clash at Cannae, among others. Altdorfer's contribution was expected to match their size and power. What he delivered exceeded all expectation. The panel for which he prepared was tall and narrow, dictated by the architecture of the Duke's room. Rather than struggle against the constraints, Altdorfer transformed them into a virtue. The composition he devised did not simply depict a battlefield. It rose above it, then above the earth itself, until land and sea curved into a planetary horizon. From the bleeding clash of cavalry to the silver-blue sweep of the Mediterranean, to the oversized island of Cyprus, even to the far-off Nile and the Red Sea, the world unfurled in breathtaking scope. This was not simply a battle painting. It was a cosmography of conflict. Thousands of soldiers, seemingly countless, swarmed across the foreground, armor flashing like a field of sparks. Altdorfer rendered Alexander leading his heavily armored companion cavalry in a brilliant blue tide, pressing against the Persians, who flee in a wave of crimson. Darius, standing in his chariot drawn by 3 horses, twists desperately to look back at the young conqueror chasing him. The scale is staggering. Ranks of warriors melt into the terrain, blending into the slopes that descend toward the sea. Below, tents spread along the shoreline beside a city that is likely meant to represent ancient Tarsus. Behind it, mountains rise that never existed in reality. Borrowed instead from the imaginative geography of Hartmann Schädel's Nuremberg Chronicle, one of Altdorfer's primary sources. The war is everywhere, in the lances, in the clouds, in the very tilt of the earth. But it is the sky, more than the armies, that defines the painting's true meaning. A massive sun blazes on one side of the heavens, casting golden fire across distant continents. Opposite it hangs a pale crescent moon framed by storm clouds. The 2 celestial bodies face one another like rival kings locked in eternal opposition. Scholars have long noted that this sky echoes the apocalyptic visions of the Book of Daniel, in which great empires rise and fall in divine sequence: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. For many in Altdorfer's time, the fall of Persia to Alexander marked one of these God-ordained transitions, a turning of the gears of sacred history. The symbolism also struck closer to home. In 1529, when Altdorfer began this painting, the armies of Suleiman the Magnificent had laid siege to Vienna for Europe. The Ottoman threat was so real that any victory over an Eastern enemy carried political weight. Altdorfer responded not with a literal retelling of antiquity, but with an intentional collision of eras. He dressed Alexander's soldiers like 16th-century European cavalry. He clothed the Persians like 16th-century Ottoman warriors. Darius's troops wear turbans. Alexander's men gleam in contemporary steel. This was no historical error. It was deliberate allegory. The rising sun, Alexander's side, radiates across the Mediterranean, illuminating the Nile and the western lands. The moon, over Darius, casts a cold pall over the east. The message is clear: light over darkness, Christendom over the advancing Ottoman power. For Altdorfer and for Duke William, Issus was not only ancient history. It was a mirror in which the fate of their own century could be seen. Floating above the battlefield hangs a tablet, held aloft as if by unseen forces, bearing the account of the battle. The original inscription was in German, likely penned by the Duke's historian Johannes Aventinus, though it was later swapped for Latin. It proclaims that Alexander slew over 100,000 Persian infantry and 10,000 cavalry, while Darius escaped with only a handful of horsemen. At the bottom edge, Altdorfer left his monogram, AA, nested one inside the other, and the proud declaration, Albrecht Altdorfer of Regensburg made this. Below the tablet, the armies carry banners inscribed with their troop numbers and predicted losses, further weaving text into the spectacle of the image. Accuracy was never the painting's aim. The topography is impossible. The placement of cities is symbolic rather than literal. Cyprus is far too large. The mountains are inventions, and Altdorfer even scattered aristocratic women dressed like 16th-century German ladies on a hunting excursion, directly on the battlefield. A dramatic flourish inspired purely by his taste for invention rather than by historical accounts. Yet none of this weakens the work. Instead, it elevates it. The Battle of Issus becomes a fusion of real history, medieval chronicle lore, Renaissance political anxiety, and cosmic symbolism. It becomes not a document, but a vision, the world convulsing under the weight of destiny. To understand how Altdorfer conceived a work of such unprecedented scale, one must trace the artistic echoes that guided him. Though his imagination was uniquely his own, several influences left deep imprints on the Battle of Alexander at Issus. One of the strongest came from Matthias Grunewald. Art historians note that both painters shared a fiercely unrestrained imagination, visible especially in their skies. The fiery, supernatural glow that floods Altdorfer's battlefield recalls Grunewald's radiant heavens in the Eisenheim altarpiece, where divine presence is rendered in swirling, almost otherworldly light. Lucas Cranach the Elder, a prominent figure of the Danube school alongside Altdorfer, played an important role as well. Cranach's early works gave landscape a new prominence, wrapping saints, prophets, and hermits in vast atmospheric settings that shaped mood as powerfully as the human figures themselves. Altdorfer inherited this idea and magnified it, using dramatic topography not as backdrop but as narrative force. And always there was Albrecht Dürer. Altdorfer admired Dürer deeply. His graphic precision, his religious symbolism, his ability to place sacred events within convincingly rendered German landscapes, Dürer's influence runs through Altdorfer's religious works, and ultimately into the Issus painting, where heaven itself becomes a narrative agent. But the conceptual roots of the Battle of Issus also stretch back to a project Altdorfer completed years earlier, the triumphal procession of Emperor Maximilian I. This monumental illuminated manuscript, created between 1512 and 1516, paraded across hundreds of pages, filled with armies, banners, heavenly portents, cartouches, and mythic allusions. It trained Altdorfer to think on vast narrative scales, to orchestrate thousands of figures within a single sweeping vision. Skills he would ultimately unleash on the Issus panel. Before Altdorfer, depictions of Alexander and Darius at Issus were rare. The earliest known was painted around 310 BCE by Philoxenus of Eretria, commissioned by Cassander, a successor of Alexander. In that ancient image, Alexander lunges forward with fearless resolve while Darius turns to flee, terror etched across his face. The Roman writer Pliny praised it as a masterpiece. Another tradition claims that the painting might have been created not by Philoxenus, but by Helena of Egypt, one of the few women recorded as an artist in antiquity. Her work, according to ancient testimony, once hung in the Temple of Peace during the reign of Vespasian. The most famous surviving echo of these early images is the Alexander mosaic, crafted around 100 BCE. Discovered in 1831 in Pompey's House of the Faun, it consists of more than 1 million tiny tesserae, meticulously arranged to capture the struggle between the two kings at close quarters. Although Altdorfer never saw this mosaic, it was unearthed centuries after his death, his painting shares its intensity and dynamism. Altdorfer's finished work, painted in oil on a limewood panel, measures 158.4 by 120.3 centimeters, a vertical composition dictated by the architectural demands of the Duke's room. The perspective begins almost at eye level among the soldiers and then impossibly lifts, as if the viewer ascends into the heavens, until continents and seas curve like a globe beneath the clouds. In the lower half, the battlefield heaves with life and death. Dense knots of infantry and cavalry clash amid a forest of spears. Alexander charges on his white horse, leading his armored companions in a thrust toward Darius, who is speeding away in a chariot drawn by 3 horses. While the Macedonians wear heavy European armor, the Persians ride bareback or in turbans. Altdorfer's intentional temporal transposition. The battle rolls downhill toward a shoreline lined with tents and a fortified city, likely intended as Tarsus, a classical center known for its intellectual heritage. Beyond the city lies the turquoise stretch of the Mediterranean, and beyond that, the oversized island of Cyprus. Further still flows the Nile, splitting into 7 gleaming channels as it reaches the Delta Mountains, rivers, continents, none of them strictly accurate, all borrowed from the imaginative maps of the Nuremberg Chronicle. Above this sprawling world rises the painting's most arresting feature, the apocalyptic sky. To the left, the sun bursts through masses of radiant cloud, drenching the western world in warm light. To the right, a cold crescent moon hangs over shadowed lands. Between them swirls a churning vortex of dark and luminous clouds. This immense sky, which once extended even higher before the panel was trimmed, transforms the battle from earthly conflict into cosmic drama. Suspended between heaven and earth hangs a tablet inscribed with the narrative of Alexander's triumph. The totals of soldiers killed, the capture of Darius's family, Altdorfer's own monogram and signature anchor the lower edge. Modern viewers often notice the obvious anachronisms: medieval armor in a Bronze Age battle, Ottoman turbans on Persian soldiers, Renaissance ladies with feathered hats inexplicably wandering the battlefield. Yet these are not misunderstandings. They are the heart of the painting. In 1529, Europe held its breath as Ottoman forces besieged Vienna. To a viewer of Altdorfer's time, the parallel was unmistakable. The ancient victory of a Western hero over an Eastern monarch, mirrored in the struggle against the Ottoman threat dressing Darius's forces as Turks made the allegory explicit. Alexander becomes a symbol of deliverance. Darius becomes a symbol of encroaching danger. The comparison extended even further. Some scholars argue that the painting's conception of time is untimely on purpose, that Altdorfer was not merely overlaying one era onto another, but rejecting historical separation altogether. In this view, all empires, all struggles, repeat in a sacred cyclical rhythm. Persia becomes the Ottoman Empire. Alexander becomes Christendom's defender. History collapses into a single divine pattern. The sky binds this symbolic vision. Alexander's force surges beneath the blazing sun, an ancient emblem linked to his divine status in Egyptian tradition. Darius's retreat unfolds under the crescent moon, which in Altdorfer's age was strongly associated with the Islamic East. But beyond political resonance, the heavens reflect the apocalyptic expectations of the 16th century. The Book of Daniel, widely read at the time, describes 4 kingdoms destined to rise and fall before the end of days. Altdorfer's rendering of Issus, Persia falling to Greece, marks one of these transitions. The vastness of the sky, the tension between sun and moon, and the looming sense of cosmic upheaval all gesture toward the belief that history was racing toward an inevitable climax. In Altdorfer's hands, a battle becomes a metaphysical turning point, an event echoing on a planetary scale. For centuries after its creation, the Battle of Alexander at Issus remained an esteemed jewel in the collection of the Dukes of Bavaria. By the late 18th century, it hung proudly in the galleries of Schleißheim Palace, where visitors marveled at its immense sweep and uncanny scale. Then came Napoleon. When French forces swept through Bavaria in 1800, the victors seized dozens of artworks as spoils of war. Among the 72 paintings they carried back to France was Altdorfer's immense Vision of Issus, a work Napoleon admired personally, not least because of his own fascination with Alexander the Great. For a brief period, the painting hung in the Louvre. Later, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he claimed the painting for his private use. One account even places it in his bathroom at the Château de Saint-Cloud, when Prussian troops stormed the residence in 1814. After Napoleon's defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition, the painting, along with many others, was returned to the King of Bavaria in 1815. From there, it eventually entered the newly founded Alte Pinakothek in Munich, where it still hangs today. 5 of the original 8 battle paintings from Duke William's cycle are now in that museum. The remaining 3 reside in Stockholm, taken during the upheaval of the 30 Years' War. Only one other Altdorfer painting hangs in the Alte Pinakothek, Susanna and the Elders, a radiant work from 1526. But it is the Issus panel that dominates the space, towering over viewers as it must have towered over Duke William's guests nearly 5 centuries ago. Placed within its broader cultural setting, the Battle of Alexander at Issus shines not only as a masterpiece but as a distillation of the Northern Renaissance. This era emphasized classical literacy, intellectual discovery, and the growing sense of the individual as a unique, self-defining being. Where medieval art had diluted personal identity in favor of collective religious meaning, Renaissance art highlighted named figures, emotional expression, and personal destiny. Altdorfer's painting embraces this shift. Though he fills the field with anonymous soldiers, rows upon rows of nearly interchangeable forms, he also elevates 2 distinct personalities, Alexander and Darius. They are not blurred into the mass. They stand apart, marked by banners and inscriptions, by posture and force. These kings are individuals with names, choices, and consequences. Renaissance viewers would have identified with them, seeing reflections of their own political fears, ambitions, and hopes. Although Altdorfer lived in the early 16th century, the emotional intensity of his work foreshadows the movements that would flourish hundreds of years later. His storm-racked skies, distorted perspectives, and cosmic landscapes resonate strikingly with 19th century Romanticism and 20th century Expressionism. Writers like Kenneth Clark have pointed out that Altdorfer, Grunewald, and Hieronymus Bosch all used visual languages that feel startlingly modern. Symbols and shapes echoed by artists from Vincent van Gogh to Max Ernst, from Graham Sutherland to even Walt Disney. These later painters shared Altdorfer's fascination with the inner turmoil of nature, the psychological pulse of landscape, and the power of exaggerated form. But perhaps the closest modern kin to Altdorfer's Issus are the Expressionists, whose jagged skies and emotional distortions echo the visionary turbulence of his work. His landscapes rise and fall like living beings. His clouds twist as if stirred by divine breath. This is nature not as setting, but as a full participant in human destiny. The Battle of Alexander at Issus is widely regarded as Altdorfer's crowning achievement. Scholars often treat it in splendid isolation from the rest of the Duke's battle cycle. Not because the others lack interest, but because the Issus panel is so commanding in ambition that it overshadows its companions. One early admirer, the German writer Friedrich Schlegel, called it a small painted Iliad, recognizing in it the epic sweep and emotional gravity of Homeric poetry. Its complexity is staggering. Thousands of figures woven into a single tapestry, an entire world mapped beneath an apocalyptic sky, layers of political and theological meaning interlaced with historical narrative. The perspective rises from the dirt of the battlefield to the curvature of the earth itself. The painting reads like an atlas, a chronicle, a prophecy, and a dramatic tableau all at once. Reinhard Koselleck described the depiction of the multitude of soldiers, each tiny yet indispensable, as evidence of a mastery unseen before. Kathleen Davis called the work epical in every sense, yet for all its grandeur, the panel remains profoundly human. It shows fear and courage, victory and collapse, day and night, history and myth, all caught in a single suspended moment. Altdorfer died in Regensburg in 1538, leaving behind a vast body of work: panels, drawings, watercolors, engravings, etchings, murals, architectural designs. But none of these, magnificent though they are, captures his genius as fully as this single panel painted for a Bavarian duke in the shadow of the Ottoman advance. The Battle of Alexander at Issus is not only a painting. It is an entire world, compressed into wood and oil. It is Altdorfer's vision of history as a cosmic drama. And it continues to command awe, nearly 5 centuries after he laid down his brush.